Now.
On 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
WMAL. 6:07 now. As we charge through this very busy Wednesday morning in your nation's capital, we've got more reaction to last night's debate, and we'll get you up to speed if you missed any of it. And, of course, the troubles in the Middle East on the agenda today. In 30 minutes, we'll check in with Cal Thomas, syndicated columnist. At 7:05, former Lieutenant Governor of California and surrogate for the Trump campaign, Abel Maldonado. 8:05, Steve Moore, economist, will join us. And then at 8:35, Brent Bozell of Media Research Center. It's Larry O'Connor with Julie Gunlock. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning.
Tim Kaine, let's face it, he's the former governor of Virginia, now the senator, many-term senator of Virginia, former running mate to Hillary Clinton for vice president, but that didn't work out. He has always fashioned himself as sort of this moderate guy, right? Oh, I'm not like one of those crazy left-wing Democrats, but now, sadly, on one of the most critical issues that used to be something that Republicans and Democrats could agree upon, it looks like Tim Kaine is, in fact, throwing down with the sort of Bernie Sanders AOC squad wing of the Democrat Party. He is in favor of blocking some weapons from being shipped to Israel. And I want to be clear here. These are weapon systems and weapons that, number one, Israel needs as they're literally facing an existential threat from Iran and other terrorist groups backed by Iran, number one. Number two, it's already been voted on. It's already been funded. It's already been approved. So the only reason to block it, well, I'm not quite sure why you would block it if you are, in fact, an ally to Israel. Let's bring in Ron Halber, Chief Executive Officer for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. Maybe you can help explain this, Mr. Halber, because, I mean, Kaine's record is not hostile to Israel that I'm aware of. So what do you make of this?
First of all, thank you for having me this morning. Senator Kaine has been an ally to the Jewish community when he was governor, and he's been an ally to the Jewish community while he's been in the Senate. But I think recently, this war has, because of the high casualty rate in Gaza, has made a lot of allies of Israel who are strongly support their right to defense, but also care deeply about human rights, a little queasy, and they feel that the way to handle that is to limit offensive weaponry to Israel. But of course, we know that's just not the answer.
Well, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm looking at the calendar. We're 5 days away from the one-year anniversary of October 7th, and I'm not sure how someone can look at the events of October 7th and not recognize that it is, in fact, Israel's right. What we're seeing play out in Gaza against Hamas over the course of the last year is exactly what Israel defending herself looks like. It's unsustainable to live next door to Hamas terrorists funded by this administration, by the way, who are hell-bent on carrying out more October 7th. What about that does Senator Kaine not understand?
Well, I happen to agree with the argument that you just made. I mean, there's no country that would not react militarily to that, and they just discovered plans in the north that Hezbollah actually planned on October 7th last year to conduct a similar raid, and that there were 3,000 terrorists positioned to do so, but the Israeli Air Force bombardments pushed them back to the border. Imagine that had occurred on two fronts at the same time. I think what the problem is people are trying to distinguish between defensive weaponry and offensive weaponry. So you'll hear Tim Kaine, there's been some members of Congress who have gone to the extreme. Like, I wouldn't put Tim Kaine in the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party is a bird that has one wing and flies, with a handful of members who are really out there. You have sort of people who are adjacent to that, and then you have people like, Tim, who I think are kind of wavering. I expect him today, after being in touch with him, that he's going to be issuing a pro-Israel statement in support of Israel after the Iranian bombardment. But if they're around attempting to bombard Israel, and I expect him to issue a statement like that. But yes, I feel that Tim and others who are trying to distinguish between defensive and offensive weaponry are, one, sending a terrible signal to America's allies that can the United States depend on you in the case of war? And number two, it's an unrealistic distinction. You can't just build a dome around yourself and protect yourself instantly, and that be your defense. You have to strike out at your enemies and prevent them from hitting you in the first place, or hit them harder so that if they do attack you, you're minimizing the damage. This idea that the country should have a shield but not a sword is certainly not strategically sound, and that's why I'm a little surprised that the senator has issued that statement.
I also wonder, Ron, about the information that he's getting because, Israel is, of course, defending itself, but they're also their actions are going to help Muslims in that region. I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah, the Houthis are doing nothing to help Muslims in that region. They're hurting them, they're murdering them, they're putting them at risk. And so I just, we had reports after Israel struck Lebanon last week that Muslims in the region were actually celebrating. So I do
get some of your best candy. People were passing it out like crazy.
Well, no, but Ron, I actually had heard that in Syria, for instance, some Muslims were actually celebrating that some of these military leaders in Hezbollah had been killed because they are ultimately the victims of Hezbollah and Hamas, and Israel striking them and putting them out of business essentially ultimately is going to help Muslims in that region. So, you had mentioned sort of Democrats being concerned from a human rights perspective, and maybe that drives them to say these kinds of things. But if you're really concerned about human rights, you should be in favor of Israel striking and putting out of business these terrorists.
Well, you're not going to get an argument from me. I agree with you. I mean, you have to realize that most of the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah, these are all foreign entities created in sovereign Arab nations that are creating disruption for the population. And that's why when Israel expelled the PLO from Lebanon in 1982, they were greeted with flowers. The problem is that Israel overstayed their welcome, and Hezbollah got created to a victim, which is why you're hearing now Israel's going to go in and not stay for a long time because they don't want to build up the resentment of the population that comes with an occupation. But the reality is that millions of Arab citizens are suffering under these terrorist entities by Iran who cause havoc and disruption. And what Israel is trying to do right now is to rewrite the Middle East strategic chessboard. Imagine Iran has always counted on Hezbollah as almost like a part of a nuclear triad, like a second strike capability. In the event that Israel were ever to go ahead and to try to hit Iran, they would rain 150,000 missiles down on Israel. Now, the New York Times reports that 75,000 of those missiles approximately, nobody knows if it's 150 or 200, but even 10 can cause great damage. So it's a step in the right direction, but Israel has a while to go. They need to remove the threat so that 60,000 people, which is probably more like 80,000 according to new reports, people have had to leave their homes. That means that they can't even send their kids to their local school. So they've been forced to move into the middle of the country. I mean, think about it. Hezbollah has usually, when you create a security zone, you create a zone on foreign territory to protect your country. They've created a security zone in Israel. Israel's only 6 hours. It only takes 6 hours to drive from the top of Israel to northern Israel. So from to the end of Israel. It's a small country the size of New Jersey. You can't have terrorists on your border and 150,000 missiles pointed at you and expect to live in peace. And Israel, in fact, is doing the work of the West right now. Americans should be cheering on Israel. They should be celebrating that Israel is getting rid of Hamas, celebrating that Hezbollah is going to be gone. Imagine the strength right now. What we should be hearing from the White House. And it is yesterday what the president said there's going to be severe consequences, even though nobody was killed. Actually, one person was killed. It happened to be
a Palestinian.
A Palestinian. Yeah. So much for liberation. Right. What I would like to hear from the Biden administration, I'd like to hear Israel say that any future attack will result in a overwhelming U.S. and Israeli military response that the Iranians will not recover from.
Yeah, That was woefully missing from both statements yesterday from Biden and Harris. Ron Halber, can you say this is such an important issue and it's affecting the Jewish community here at home? And by the way, it's in the middle of a presidential campaign. Can you give us 5 more minutes to talk about that aspect of this?
I'll give you 10 more minutes.
All right, thank you, Ron Halber. I'm not trying to be greedy. CEO of Jewish Community Relations Council will continue in just 60 seconds. We're speaking with Ron Halber, Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Community Relations Council here in Greater Washington. And we also, by the way, extend a Shana Tova. I hope I did that right. And Happy New Year.
You did that better than me.
As today is, it's sundown. It'll mark Rosh Hashanah and worldwide, obviously, for Jews everywhere. And I think that can't be overlooked, that Iran decided on the eve of a very holy day on the Jewish calendar to launch this attack. There is something despicable and psychological. Oftentimes, these acts of war against the state of Israel are framed within your holy calendar. That's not an accident, is it, Ron?
No, I mean, remember, we referred to the 1973 attack as the Yom Kippur War. It happened on Yom Kippur when they knew Israelis, they attacked Israel. The October 7th attack last year occurred on Simchat Torah, which is when we celebrate the fact that we have gone ahead and finished reading the 5 Books of Moses, and we're beginning to start again for the yearly ritual reading again. And so I have a friend whose birthday is October 7th, and he always says the Arabs have spoiled it twice for me. Meaning the war and this, which is, kind of an offhanded, dark joke. But
after centuries of persecution, the Jewish people have figured out a way to laugh in the face of these things. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
actually,
that's why there's some. I'm convinced that's why there's so many Jewish comedians. But the reality is that first of all, part of Iran's effort to strike at Israel is not just military but psychological. I mean, the idea is they want to cause the withering of the state. Nasrallah always said that Israel was just like a spider web that will collapse, and what he found out is that Israel is a spider web built of steel, and the people are resilient, and they're running for cover, and Israel is winning the war, which is I expected. October 7th was an absolute operational strategic failure. The idea that Israel could leave itself undefended in that area and that should simply come over the border and slaughter people with impunity is just absolutely just psychologically damaging to Israel and the Jewish people. And October 7th is going to remain embedded in our collective mindset for a century as a day of terror. And it's coming up. It's right. It's like we're a couple days. The Jewish community in Washington, which is the third largest in the United States, over 300,000 people. There's going to be a huge gathering downtown, and a lot of people are going to be live streaming it, and it's going to be a day of mourning. And I do believe that on that day there will be some sort of action against Israel militarily as some sort of symbolic reminder from the Arab world. It may not be great because of their, like Hamas has great diminished capacity. They might fire off a missile or two for a psychological, which will probably get struck down by Iron Dome. But nevertheless, every time it's fired, there's always a chance Iron Dome won't work. People can get killed, and I think the war with Hezbollah will continue for a couple of weeks. And it certainly is meant to make the Jewish community, but the Jewish community in Israel and the United States are quite strong and resilient, and we're not, and in the face of adversity, we plan to continue to be strong. Our community. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Ron, just before we end, I do want to get your thoughts on how you think this will affect. You talked about the Jewish community being resilient. You talked about the Jewish community, the reaction to this. How will the Jewish community vote? How will this latest attack on Israel? And, we're just coming off the VP debates. What do you think this new reality, how will this affect the voting of that community?
It's a very interesting question, and I can only speculate. For many years, anti-Semitism in Israel, if you asked American Jewish voters where it was on the top of their concerns, it was really at the bottom. And some people may say, well, isn't that surprising? Well, the answer is no, because American Jews were not worried about anti-Semitism in this country because it wasn't at the astronomical rate it is now, and Israel's security was pretty secure. Israel's security was pretty much guaranteed. Most Democrats and Republicans met the basic threshold. Will you support Israel during times of war? Yes. Will you give munitions to Israel if she needs it? Yes. Will you veto these crazy resolutions against Israel? And would you be supportive of criticizing these resolutions against Israel in the UN? Yeah. So there was basically a common denominator that both parties met, except extremists like, crazy Bernie Sanders on the left, that most people would go ahead and crazy isolationists on the right would meet. So it wasn't a factor. But I think many more Jews, who you tend to vote about 70% Democrat, are going to, a lot of them are for the first time, are going to include in elected officials, are going to weigh the ticket in terms of response, how strong they support Israel, and how strong they're willing to condemn anti-Semitism. So, you see that, for example, taking place in Maryland, and where Governor Larry Hogan, who I had the pleasure of traveling to Israel with and working with him when he was governor, it will get a higher than normal significant vote from the Jewish community. Now, Andrew Alsobrooks will get the majority. But the question is, will it be 55 or will it be 85? So I do think some segments of the Jewish community will, there'll be some people in the Jewish community who are just terrified of Donald Trump winning and will vote straight Democrat. But I think there will also be some more ticket splitting this time, where you might find some people in the Jewish community voting against Trump overwhelmingly, but then possibly voting for Republicans down for the Senate because they want to make sure there's a counterbalance and a strong foreign policy. So I think the Jewish community is very split, and I mean, don't worry, they'll still overwhelmingly vote Democrat, but I'd be interested in seeing what are the results of the election underneath the presidential, the Senate campaign, the House campaigns, because anti-Semitism and Israel are definitely at the top of the minds of Jewish voters this year.
As well they should be. And by the way, it's at the top of the minds, or at least up there with Christian voters as well, I want you to know, as we are and continue to be your ally. Well. Yeah, Ron Halber, we'll leave it there. It is interesting to note, though, and you're right about the general Jewish vote, but I've seen some polls that show if you are, in fact, an observant Jew, if you're an observant Jew and you take your faith seriously, those numbers have swung quite a bit in the Republicans' direction, and it's an interesting phenomenon to watch. But we do have to leave it there, sadly. Thank you so much, though. Really great conversation. Yes, great. And again, Happy New Year.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app.
O'Connor and Company.
6:36, and if you like news, politics, world events, and getting a smile on your face to start your day, you've come to the right place. It's O'Connor and Company. Coming up at 7:05, Abel Maldonado, the former Lieutenant Governor of California, now part of the Trump campaign. 8:05, Steve Moore, economist extraordinaire. And at 8:35, Brent Bozell, Media Research Center, our buddy who's got plenty to say about those debate moderators last night. I'm Larry O'Connor. That right there is Julie Gunlock. She's a blonde.
Good morning.
Well, it's true. Fact check you. Listen, Julie, we've only scratched the surface on last night's debate. And again, I don't want to overstate the case, but it truly was a magnificent performance from J.D. Vance. A great way to introduce himself, because he's been talked about a lot by the corporate media, but he hasn't actually had a chance to introduce himself. And as we bring Cal Thomas here, our friend and syndicated columnist who's seen plenty of these debates, I just want to play this small 40-second moment here, because it does encapsulate how dominant J.D. Vance was.
Honestly, Tim, I think you got a tough job here, because you've got to play whack-a-mole. You've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver rising take-home pay, which of course he did. You've got to pretend that Donald Trump didn't deliver lower inflation, which of course he did. And then you simultaneously got to defend Kamala Harris's atrocious economic record, which has made gas, groceries, and housing unaffordable for American citizens. I was raised by a woman who would sometimes go into medical debt so that she could put food on the table in our household. I know what it's like to not be able to afford the things that you need to afford. We can do so much better. To all of you watching, we can get back to an America that's affordable again. We just got to get back to common sense economic principle.
I mean, Cal
Thomas,
I'm sorry. I'm a Republican. I'm rooting for this guy, but good Lord, I don't think I've ever seen a debate performance like this.
No, it was excellent, and I love the Wall Street Journal editorial this morning. It said that J.D. outperformed Trump. He said a lot of things that Trump should have said in his debate with Joe Biden. I think he scored on virtually every point. He dodged, Walz did, the abortion question. He didn't know his own law that allows abortion up to the 9th month of pregnancy. He said that's not what it says, but the fact is it did say, and the two moderators, of course, didn't challenge him. They challenged Vance a couple of times, and I thought some of the questions were slanted against Vance, and they didn't really challenge Walz all that much. The one thing that I thought was lacking as they got to taxes and all this Democrat talking point about fair share that billionaires should pay. We've been down that road since Franklin Roosevelt. The one thing they didn't get to, I wish they had, was the spending. That's the problem. And Donald Trump has said he's going to bring in an outside auditor to audit the entire federal government and to see what we could get rid of. It's not that the federal government is low on revenue. They get record revenue. It's that they can't control themselves on spending. And that's the one thing that I wish had been brought up. The gun violence business, Vance said that 90% of the gun violence was because of illegal weapons. A lot of the mental health cases, he was right about that. It's interesting to see the newspapers this morning. Washington Times and the Wall Street Journal had it right on who won the debate and who did better. New York Times, of course, and some of the other left-wing publications. Oh, no, Vance was wrong on so many things. And the Washington Post fact-checker over fact-checks Vance and under fact-checks Walz. Typical.
Yeah, what did you think of Walz? I mean, he had quite a few missteps there, particularly on his response on the China issue. He just sort of, it was weird when he first started replying to that question. He went all the way back to when he was riding his bike until the lights went on. I mean, he really tried to avoid it. And that was the one moment when Margaret, I think she actually said to him, wait, the question was this. And
the question was, why did you lie about where you were during Tiananmen Square?
Yeah, and then there was this sort of pregnant pause where they let him sort of stew in his own embarrassment. Do you think that will have an effect that where he looked unprepared, he looked scared, he looked sort of befuddled? Do you think that will resonate with voters?
Yeah, he kept writing all the time. I thought he was either writing a memoir or a ransom note. I don't know what. But the whole thing about Hong Kong, I think the best label of the whole evening that Walz gave to himself, he called himself a knucklehead.
Yes!
I haven't heard that since the Three Stooges. That was pretty good.
Cal,
you were either in Hong Kong or you were in Nebraska. You can't have it both ways unless you're a time traveler. So he obviously lied about that, but he just called himself a knucklehead instead. These things have a way of, I think, losing their energy. We're 5 weeks away from the election. Most people say that the vice presidential debate doesn't matter all that much. I think it mattered more than others, as you indicated earlier, because it was civil. And people have been crying out for civility. Yeah. They actually debated issues. The cat lady thing didn't come up. The eating of dogs and cats in Springfield didn't come up. And I thought it was a substantive debate. And I thought it was great. I mean, I actually watched it.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, it was substantive, but it was substantive on a liberal playing field. Questions about daycare and Obamacare and gun control. I mean, there were no questions about Ukraine. There were no real questions about crime in the streets. But again, I don't want to nitpick too much because Vance did just dominate. I'd love for you to also comment, though, on what we're seeing transpire now in the Hurricane Helene response. As once again, obviously there's a double standard when there's a Democrat in the White House as to who to blame. But, I mean, there are people who are desperate right now, and it just doesn't seem like FEMA is focused on what they're supposed to be focused on under this administration.
Well, during the debate last night, guys, the two inquisitors claimed that it was climate change that caused Helene to happen.
The only question about the hurricane was about carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was ridiculous. This is so typical. And as far as voter concerns, the concerns about climate change are way, way down there. We know we've been lied to like we were on vaccines. Now they're running these ads on TV. You got to get your Moderna vaccine because COVID is constantly changing. Yeah, well, so are the messages from government, which is why people aren't trusting it anymore on these things. I thought that, look, hurricanes, damage, deaths, this is bipartisan, as I think Vance said last night, and they agreed on this. We shouldn't be flogging each other on who's at fault for this and that. I think, the governors have been saying people have stepped up. Churches, individuals have been helping each other. This is a natural disaster. You can't blame Republicans or Democrats for it. Let's get together and help these poor people.
I love you, Cal, and I agree with you, but I'm still ticked off about what they did to Bush during Katrina. All right, and so
I agree. Yes, of course. Yeah.
And
well,
they get to do that, and then they get to do it to Trump for Maria, and then when there's Democrat, hey, let's not blame anybody. It's a natural disaster. But you're right. Of course,
and so is Kamala Harris a natural disaster. But that's another story.
There's the drop mic moment we've been waiting for. Thank you, Cal. We'll talk to you next week.
Mark Levin, weeknights from 6 till 9.
On News Talk 105.9 WMAL.
Making sense of the news.
Julie Gunlock, a stunning article in The Atlantic that headlined "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books." To read a book in college, it helps to have read a book in high school. The article by Rose Horowitz details college professors, specifically in the humanities and literature, who over the past decade say students are overwhelmed by the reading assignments because they actually graduate high school never reading a book, like an actual book of literature. I used to joke with because my kids were homeschooled and then private school, but we always emphasized classical education. I would say, our kids are reading Homer, the other kids are watching Homer Simpson. Right.
Yes. My children are memorizing Shakespeare. Other kids are, avoiding knife fights in the public schools. Look, first of all, the first thing that comes to mind is, why are these elite colleges allowing kids to attend their college?
Right. Why isn't this part of the admissions process?
Yeah. I mean, maybe ask a question. Have you read a full book? Of course, this is an indictment of both higher education and K through 12 education. But ultimately, we can thank Randy Weingarten for this, who has been in control, of the school unions, teachers unions rather, that have controlled the public schools in this country. And we know that education is not the priority for the teachers unions or really public schools now. So this is a huge advertisement for private and classical schools.
And they've emphasized everything but basic classical education that we in the Western world have always held dear. When you suggest that they should read, Augustine's Confessions or City of God, when they should read Iliad, they should read Shakespeare, they should read these things, you're accused of racial colonialism by focusing on Western literature and the giants of Western philosophy that this nation was formed on and that our culture was formed on. By the way, the upshot of this article, The Atlantic will never have the cognitive realization that the very policies they support as liberal left-wingers in the public school system is what's led to this void of intellectualism in higher education. But college professors, what are they doing to accommodate for this? They're thinning down the syllabus.
Well, they are.
They're dumbing it down to accommodate the low bar that has been set in high school.
And I do laugh at the Atlantic headline, which is like, gosh, with the elite colleges, they admitting students who can't read books. But some parts of this article are really interesting. It says, for more than 2 decades, new educational initiatives such as No Child Left Behind and Common Core emphasize informational texts and standardized tests. Teachers at many schools shifted from books to short informational passages, followed by questions about the author's main idea, mimicking the format of standardized reading comprehension tests. So, in other words, and I saw this because my kids were in the public schools for elementary school, and I saw this all the time. They would come home with passages from books. They'd have conversations about it in the class setting, but they would never actually get a book. Yeah. And that bothered me. That nagged at me.
But the good news is parents can take control of this if you're stuck in those schools and they're not giving your kid the education you want. It's just as simple as getting a book. And by the way, here's what I really recommend, because I did it with my kids. Get a book, like a classic of Western literature, and read it with your child.
Yes, or read it to them, yes.
You will get that education at the same time. And reading a classic with your child and then discussing it, you will view it in a way that is very different than you would if you just read it by yourself. But for God's sake, I mean, you've only got your kids for a handful of years. This is the chance and opportunity to fill in what the public expert educators directed from Washington, D.C. have failed to do. It's 6:54.